Good day, dear students. Today we are going to start with our lecture number 28 of social linguistics, which is going to be a continuation of what we were studying previously in the previous lectures, how language is considered in different societies and how does it link. Now, find out about what you can about the basic English. So in what ways is it a reduced form of standard English? Do the kinds of reductions introduced into basic English make it simpler to learn and use? So now when we related to what we were studying in the previous lecture, today we want to say that we want to find out what are the rules of the basic English. So when we start talking about the basic English or standard English rules, so in what way is it reduced form of the standard English? Now, how can we reduce the standard English to make it a basic English? Now, do the kinds of reductions introduced into basic English make it simpler to learn and use? You will have to define simpler. From time to time, certain users of languages such as French and German have objected to borrowings, in particular borrowings from English. So what Anglicisms have been objected to? What kinds of native resources have been suggested as suitable alternative sources of exploitation in order to develop and or purify the language? And what motivates the objections of the language? So some Chinese scholars are concerned with developing the vocabulary of Chinese to make it usable for every kind of scientific and technical endeavors. So they reject the idea that such vocabulary should be borrowed from other languages. So what do you think they hope to gain by doing this? Why do they want to change the language? Do they lose anything if they would be successful in doing so? So a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. So is a well-known observation. So today we would add an air force. True, if so, what are the consequences? So once when we say that a language is a dialect, so a dialect with an army or a navy, so a language has its different categories in dialects, and the dialects are the army or the navy of the language, and a well-known observation. So now we would say that a little bit more advanced than an army or a navy, the Air Force. So if we have an addition also to add in that. So the dialect would be even more nowadays. True? If so, what are the consequences? So in the UNESCO Courier of April 2000, a writer makes the following observation. Languages usually have a relatively short lifespan as well as a very high death rate. So only a few, including Basque Egyptians, Chinese, Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Persian, Sanskrit, or Tamil have lasted more than 2,000 years. So languages usually, relative to have a short span, that they have a very small lifespan, and that means that they don't last long. And communities start forgetting about those languages, and then they start to diminish. So how is the statement at best a half-truth? That only including the languages usually have a very high death rate, because old languages would die out and the new would be increased also in it. So now when we consider that are the Australian and the New Zealand or Canadian and the other national varieties of English, new dialects of English, or autonomous languages, or possibly even both. You can see Hickney in 2004, or Gordon et al. In 2004, and Trudgill in 2004 also, for references to this. So when we say that yes, these lifespans also, the languages are short and have a low lifespan, that means that basically what we're trying to say is that when these languages are not transferred from generation to generation, then they sort of die out because they wouldn't be able to survive without that language being spoken constantly. So some languages that are good, that are long-lasting or more international, or let's say commonly spoken in several different countries, then that would be able, they are able to survive. But languages that are spoken less frequently would have difficulty in surviving. So when we speak of social linguistics with the regional dialects, now regional variation in the way a language is spoken is likely to provide one of the easiest ways of observing variety in language. So one way to observe a variety in language would be that a way a language is spoken is likely to provide one easiest way of seeing. So how we speak a language would tell us what, observe the variety in the language. So as you travel throughout a wide geographical area in which a language is spoken, so and particularly if that language has been spoken in, that area for, let's say, a pretty long period of time or hundreds of years, you are almost certain to notice differences in pronunciation, in the choices and forms, dialects and varieties of words, and the syntax. So when we say that we throughout a wide geographical area in which language is formed, so we would say that particularly if that language has been spoken in that area for many hundreds of years, let's for example like Urdu, so if it has been spoken in your area or Arabic for 100 of years, then that means that at that time that language can have, you can see like different people in the Arab countries have different pronunciations, and sometimes they have a different variety in which we can say that the pronunciation is different, and there you can divide it into sects and dialects, Arabic language, and you can say that there is a huge variety that has come up. So same with similar also the same things. So it's important to understand that the choice of the forms of the words, the syntax, the way you structure a sentence, the words that you would choose, and so on and so forth, would matter a huge deal. So there may even be very distinctive local colorings in the language which you notice as you move from one location to another. So such distinctive varieties are usually called regional dialects of the language. Now, as we saw earlier, the term dialect is sometimes used only if there is a strong tradition of writing in the local variety. So Old English, and to the lesser extent Middle English, had dialects in this sense. So in the absence of such a tradition of writing, the terms patois may be used to describe the variety. So however, now many linguist writings in English tend to use the dialect to describe both situations, and rarely, if at all, use patois as a specific term. So you're likely to encounter it only as a kind of anachronism, as in its use by Jamaicans, who often refer to the variety of English spoken on the island as a patois. So the dialect patois distinction actually seems to make more sense in some situations, for example France, than in the others. So in medieval France, we would say that a number of languages flourished and several were associated with strong literary traditions. So, however, as the language of Paris asserted itself from the 14th century, then these traditions withered. Parisian French spread throughout France, and even though that spread is still not yet complete, as visits to such parts of France and Brittany. So the province Corsica and Alsace will confirm it drastically reduced the importance of the local varieties. So they continue to exist largely in spoken forms only that are disfavored socially and politically. They are merely patois to those who extol the virtues of standard French. So when we say that, yes, it is different from the standard French language, then yes, true, because when we divide it into different varieties, so province Corsica and Alsace will confirm that it drastically reduced the importance of the local varieties. So when it reduces the importance of varieties, it would say that it would take, you can say, a converting way, how you can convert things into the languages and into dialects, or they continue to exist largely in spoken forms only. So it's not all about that, but about how language is spoken in spoken form instead of in written. So they are disfavored socially and politically. Now they are merely patois to those who extol the virtues of standard French. So when we say that, however, even as these varieties have faded, there have been countervailing moves to revive them, as many younger residents of the area in which they are spoken see them as strong indicators of identities they wish to preserve. So sometimes there are identities that they wish to preserve, and you would say that a much younger version of the residents of the area in which they are spoken seem to as strong indicators of identities they wish to preserve, because that's how they want to preserve the language, or preserve something that is in the language. So there are some further interesting differences in the use of the terms dialects and patois. So let's say that patois is usually used to describe only rural forms of speech, and we may talk about an urban dialect, but to talk about an urban patois would seem very, very strange. So patois also seems to refer only to the speech, let's say, of a particular situation. So patois also seems to refer only to the speech of the lower strata in society again, and we may talk about a middle class dialect, but not apparently about a middle class patois. So finally, a dialect usually has a wider geographical distribution than a patois, so that whereas regional dialect and village patois seem unobjectionable, the same cannot be said for regional patois and the village dialect. So sometimes we can say that differences between how the village people speak languages in villages, or how they would speak the language in, let's say, a city, are very, very different than what we would be speaking. Let's say in a city we would speak language in a more formal way than in informal way that we would speak in a village. So however, as I indicated above, many Jamaicans would refer to the popular spoken variety of Jamaican English as a patois rather than as a dialect. So again, the distinction is in no way an absolute one. So we can't say that the distinction is in an absolute form. So the use of the term dialect to differentiate among regional varieties of specific languages is perhaps more readily applicable to temporary conditions in Europe and some other developed countries than it would have been in medieval or Renaissance Europe or today in certain other parts of the world. So where it was and still is possible to travel long distances. So let's start again from where we broke off, that where it was still is, let's say that when we are talking about varieties of specific languages, we would be more readily applicable to contemporary conditions in Europe and some other developing countries, that it would be that the medieval and the Renaissance Europe or today would be several different parts of the world. So when we say that it's possible to travel long distances, and by making only small changes in speech from location to location, we continue to communicate with the inhabitants. So you might have to travel somewhat slowly, however, because of the necessary learning that would be involved. So every place that, yes, you can travel very fast long distances, but if you travel, let's say, in a much faster way, then you won't be, if you're not living in a community, it will be very difficult for you to judge or learn the language until you stay there. So it has been said that at one time a person could travel from the south of Italy to the north of France in this manner. So it is quite clear that such a person began the journey speaking one language and ended it speaking something entirely different. Now, however, there was no one point at which the changeover occurred, nor is there actually any way of determining how many intermediate dialect areas that person passed through. So for an intriguing empirical test of this idea, let's say that one using recent phonetic data from a continuum of Saxon and Franconian dialects in the Netherlands, C. Heringa and Nerbonne 2001. Now they conclude that the traveler perceives phonological distance indirectly and that there are unsharp borders between dialect areas. So such a situation is often referred to as a dialect continuum. What you have is a continuum of dialects sequentially, we would say, that arranged over space A, B, C, D, and so on. Now, over large distances, the dialects at each end of the continuum may well be mutually unintelligible. So, and also some of the intermediate dialects may be unintelligible with one or both the ends. So even with certain other immediate ones or intermediate ones. So in such a distribution, which dialects can be classified together under one language, and how many such languages are there? So as I have suggested, such questions are possibly a little easier to answer today in certain places than they once were before. So the hardening of political boundaries in the modern world as a result of the growth of states, particularly nation states, rather than multinational or multi-ethnic states, has led to the hardening of language boundaries. All the residents of territories on both sides of the Dutch-German border, within the West Germanic continuum, on the French-Italian border within the West Romance continuum, have many similarities in speech even today. So they will almost certainly tell you that they speak dialects of Dutch or German in the one case and French or Italian in the other. So various pressures, we would say the various pressures, political, social, culture, and educational, serve to harden current state boundaries and to make the linguistic differences among states more, not less pronounced. So dialects continue therefore to disappear as a national language arises. So they are subject to two kinds of pressure, one from within to conform to a national standard, and one from without to become different from standards elsewhere. So when a language is recognized as being spoken in different varieties, the issue, what we would say, becomes one of deciding how many varieties and how to classify each variety. So when we want to say that we are classifying something, then yes, the issue becomes one of deciding how many varieties and how to classify each and exact variety of the language. So dialect geography is a term used to describe attempts made to map the distributions of various linguistic features so as to show their geographical provenance. Now, for example, in seeking to determine features, let's say, of the dialects of English and to show their distributions, the dialect geographers try to find answers to questions such as the following. Now, the first question would be, is this an repronouncing area of English? As in words like car, are pronouncing area of English like in car or cart, or is it not? And what past tense form of drink do speakers prefer? So what names? Now these are questions I want you to go ahead and try to solve also. Repronouncing areas of English, as in words like car and cart. Do you think that it's an R pronouncing area of English? So what past tense form of drink do speakers refer to? And what would they prefer, the past tense form? Then what names do people give a particular objects in the environment? And for example, elevator or lift or petrol or gas or carousel or let's say roundabout. Now sometimes maps are drawn to show actual boundaries around such features. So boundaries called isoglosses, so as to distinguish an area in which a certain feature is found from area in which it is absent. So when several such isoglosses coincide, the result is sometimes called a dialect boundary. So when we may be tempted to say that speakers of one side of that boundary speak one dialect and speakers on the other side speak a different dialect. That means that there are two different places where the speakers are dealing with the language, and both of them have a different way of speaking the language. So as we will see when we return once again to this topic, that there are many difficulties with this kind of work. Now, finding the kinds of items that appear to distinguish one dialect from another, or collecting data. So drawing conclusions from data we collect, presenting the findings, and so on. So it is easy to see, however, how such a methodology could be used to distinguish British American, Australian, and other varieties of English from one another as various dialects of one language. So when we say yes, it could be could also be used to distinguish Cockney English from Texas English, but how could you use it to distinguish among the multifarious varieties of English found in cities like New York and London? So, or even among the varieties we observe to exist in smaller, less complex cities and towns in which various people who have always resided there are acknowledged to speak differently from one another. So finally, the term dialect particularly when it is used in reference to a regional, let's say, variation, should not be confused with the term accent. So we wouldn't say that dialect, we should, the term dialect we should say just because of the accent or the pronunciation. We shouldn't confuse it like that. So standard English, now for example, is spoken in a variety of accents. So we have standard English, which is spoken in a variety of accents, that means in different pronunciations, often with clear regional social associations. So there are accents associated with North America, Singapore, India, Liverpool, Scouse, Tyneside, Gordy, Boston, New York, and so on. So however, many people who live in such places show a remarkable uniformity to one another in their grammar and vocabulary because they speak standard English. And the differences are merely those of accent, that is how they pronounce what they say. So one English accent has achieved a certain eminence, the accent known as received pronunciation, or the RP, the accent of perhaps as few as 3% of those who live in England, let's say, as the received in received pronunciation is a bit old-fashioned snobbery. So it means the accent allows one to be received into the better parts of society. Now, this accent is of fairly, let's say, a recent origin. So becoming established as prestigious only in the late 19th century, and not even given its current label until the 1920s. So we would say that in the United Kingdom at least, it is usually associated, let's say, with a higher. So in England, you see that there are different standards of the way language is used in different communities. So we would say that in the United Kingdom, usually associated with a higher social or educational background, with the BBC and the professions, is most commonly taught to students learning English as a foreign language. So Wakelin in 1977 would be better, let's say, form of that. So for many such students, it is the only accent they are prepared to learn. And a teacher who does not, let's say, use it may have difficulty in finding a position at which, let's say that, the different position as a teacher of English in certain non-English speaking countries, in which a British accent is preferred over a North American one. So what we would say is that yes, in fact, those who use this accent are often regarded as speaking unaccented English because it lacks a regional association within England. Now, other names of this accent are the Queen's English, that would be the Oxford English, and BBC English. Now, why would we say that these have a different accent? So let's say that the United Kingdom, the BBC would have their own accent, but we wouldn't say that it's a different, what do you call it, a different dialect. We would say that it's the same thing, but just has different pronunciations. So the dialect, it's not the dialect. So we would say that it's not just the dialect which is different. So BBC has its own pronunciations and the professions, and is most commonly taught to students learning English as a foreign language. So for many such students, it is only the accent that they are prepared to learn, and a teacher who does not use it may have difficulty in finding a position as a teacher of English, because they have their certain English speaking countries with the British accent, and it is preferred over the North American accent. So in fact, now those who use this accent are often regarded as speaking accented English, because it lacks a regional association with England. So the North American accent is not preferred in England or in that, because they are more used to having the British accent. Now, in fact, those who use this accent are not often regarded as speaking unaccented English, because it lacks a regional association within England. Now, other names of this accent are the Queen's English, or the Oxford English, or the BBC English. So, however, now there is no unanimous agreement, let's say, that the Queen does in fact use the RP, but a wide variety of accents can be found among the staff and students at Oxford University, and the regional accents are now widely used in the various BBC services. So as Bauer 1994 also shows, the RP continues to change. So there is a change in the languages. So one of the most recent manifestations has been labeled Estuary English, Rose Warnes in 1994. You can see that reference as it, sometimes also called Cognified RP. So development of RP along the lower reaches of the Thames, reflecting power shift in England towards the world of finance, banking and commerce, and away from that of inherited position, the church, the law, the tradition, and the bureaucracies. So even in the church, a different form of English is spoken. The bureaucracies have their own form of the traditional language, and the church would have its own form, the law would have its own form, the finance and banking would have its own form. So in a way, there are so many different dialects spoken in different areas. So Trudgill in 1995 has pointed out what he considers to be the most interesting characteristics of RP. The relatively very small number of speakers who use it do not identify themselves as coming from any particular geographical region. So RP is largely confined to England, and there is a non-localized accent. So, and it is not necessary to speak RP to speak standard English, because standard English can be spoken with a regional accent, and in the vast majority of the cases, normalises. So it is also interesting, let's say, to observe that the 1997 English Pronouncing Dictionary, published by Cambridge University Press, abandoned the label RP in favor of BBC English. So now, why would they want to abandon their certain label of RP to favor BBC English, even though this latter term is not unproblematic, as the BBC itself has enlarged in the accent pool from which it draws its news readers. So the development of Estuary English is one part of a general leveling of accents within, let's say, the British Isles. So the changes are well documented. They see, for example, Foucault's and Docheretry in 1999 with review a variety of factors involved in the changes that are occurring in cities. Now, one feature of Assyrian English, the use of a glottal stop for T. So that would be Fabricius in 2002, is also not unique to that variety, but is spreading widely. Now, for example, to Newcastle, Cardiff, and Glasgow, and even as far as north as the rural Aberdeenshire, let's say in the northeast, Scotland. So, for example, to the Newcastle, the Cardiff, the Glasgow, and even as far as the north as rural Aberdeenshire in the northwest, Scotland Marshall in 2003, you can see that reference. So what in 2000 and 2002 used the vowels in face and goat to show that Gordy, the Newcastle accent, levels towards a regional accent norm rather than towards a national one. So almost certainly revealing a preference for establishing a regional identity rather than either a very limited local identity or a wider national one maybe. They prefer to have it a more generalized accent in North America, which is sometimes referred to as General American or more recently as Network English. So the accent, let's say, associated with the announcers of the major television networks. So other languages often have no equivalent to the RP. For example, German is spoken in a variety of accents, none of which is redeemed inherent any better than any other. Now, educational regional varieties are preferred rather than some exclusive upper class accent. So that has no clear relationship to personal achievement. So when we say that the most generalized accent of North America is sometimes referred to as General American, so then yes, General American language is let's say a more standardized form of English, because General American language would be something that is commonly spoken in the US and recently as networks of English. So the recent the accent associated with announcers on the major television networks like BBC and so forth, the other languages often have no equivalent to RP, for the example. So German is spoken in a variety of accents, none of which is deemed inherently any better than the other. So educated regional varieties are preferred rather than some exclusive upper class accent that has no clear relationship to a personal achievement. So yes, then there is a difference when we say that announcers on a major network, television network, would be different than what they speak in a normal thing in the home. So General American or more recent as Network English. So yes, because you can see that, you can even see that reference to in your own local televisions, that the people who speak as newscasters your local language is different from a common person speaking a language. So what is deemed, let's say, inherently any better than any other? So it's a more formal, so educated regional varieties are preferred rather than some exclusive upper class accent in that has no clear relationship to personal achievement. So that would be, yes, a huge difference. You see, that's how you can tell that things are maybe different, let's say. So as a final observation, I must reiterate that it is impossible to speak English without an accent. So you cannot speak this language without an accent. So the reason now why can't we speak this without an accent is that the RP is an accent, a social one rather than a regional one. So however, we must note that there are different evaluations of the different accents, evaluations arising from social factors, not linguistic ones. So Matsuda in 1991 gave that reference, and 1361, and he says, according to his research, Matsuda said in 1991, page 1361, says it is really an issue of power. So when parties are in a relationship of domination and subordination, we tend to say that the dominant is normal and the subordinate is different from the normal. So, and so it is with accent. So people in power are perceived as speaking normal, unaccented English. Any speech that is different from that construction norm is called an accent. So anything that you gain that is different from the unaccented people in power who speak the language. In the pages that follow, we will, let's say, return constantly to linguistic issues having to do with power. So, according to a discussion, let's say that what regional differences are you aware of in pronunciation of each of the following words? Butter, farm, bird, oil, bag, cot, and cot, then which, Cuba, spear, bap, with, happy, house, Mary. What past tense and or past participle forms have you heard for each of the following verbs? Let's say like bring or drink or think or sing or get or lie or lay or dive. That what are some other variants that you are aware of for each of the following sentences? So I haven't any money, I ain't done it yet, he be a farmer, give it to me or give it me, it was me what told her, who uses each variant, on what occasions. So what other names are you aware of for objects sometimes referred to as seesaws, cobwebs, sidewalks, streetcars, thumbtacks, soft drinks, gym shoes, elevators, and again, who uses each variant? So what do you yourself call each of the following: cottage cheese, highway, first grade, donuts, the griddle cakes, the peanuts, the spring onions, the baby carriages, the chest of drawers, let's say, the faucet, the frying pan, the paper bag, the porch, and maybe the sitting room, the sofa, the earthworm. So what do you yourself call each of the following: cottage cheese, highway, first grade, donuts, griddle cakes, peanuts, spring onions, baby carriages, chest of drawers? What would you call that in your own language? A faucet or a frying pan. Do you know what a faucet is? Like in British English, a faucet would be a tap. Chest of drawers is a cupboard. So paper bag, porch, sitting room, sofa, earthworm. Now each of the following is found in some variety of English. Now each is comprehensible. Which do you yourself use? what do you not use. So what you want to see is that what of these languages you use and what you yourself would not use. So explain how these utterances you do not use differ from those that you do use. So check out all of these things and see how many of these do you use and how many you don't use. So I haven't spoken to him would be one. I've not spoken to him. Is John at home? Is John home? Give me it, give it to me, give us it. I wish you would have said so. I wish you'd said so. Don't be troubling yourself. Coming home tomorrow, he is. So how might you employ a selection of items from the above questions or similar items to compile a checklist that could be used to determine the geographical and possibly social origins of a speaker of English? So a local accent may be either positively or negatively valued. So how do you value each of the following? A Yorkshire accent, a Texas accent, the accents of the Queen of England, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and the President of the United States. Think of some others also. So why do you react the way you do? Is it a question of being able to identify with the speaker or not, of social class, of education, or stereotyping, or what? So how appropriate would each of the following be? RP in a ten-a-side working class pub, network English at a Black Power rally in Harlem, and Parisian French at a Cockney game at the Montreal Forum. So A.S.C. Ross in Noblesse Oblige, Mythword in 1956, a book which discusses somewhat lightheartedly but not unseriously, we would say, differences between you, upper class, and non-you, not upper class, speech in the United Kingdom. And observes the term dialect can also be used to describe differences in speech associated with various social groups or classes. So there are social dialects as well as regional ones. An immediate problem is that the defining social group or social class. So what we are saying is that the term dialect can be used to describe different speech associated with various social groups or classes. So there are social dialects as well as the regional ones. An immediate problem is that the defining a social group or social class, giving proper weight to the various factors that can be used to determine social position, for example, occupation, place of residence, education, new versus old, money, income, racial or ethnic origin, and cultural background, the caste, your religion, and so on. So such factors as these do appear to be related fairly directly to how people speak, and there is a British public school dialect, and there is an African American vernacular English dialect found in cities such as New York, Detroit, and Buffalo. So these are states of the US and different cities there. So when we say that the American African vernacular English is different from the British public school dialect, then what do we mean by that? We mean that people would speak the language in a different way. They would maybe have different pronunciations, and how other people would speak matters a lot. And as we will see in particular, there is considerable evidence from work of investigators such as Lubov and Trudgill that social dialects can indeed be described systematically. So, whereas regional dialects are geographically based, social dialects originate among social groups and are related to a variety of factors. Now, the principal ones apparently being social class, religion, and ethnicity. In India, for example, caste, and one of the clearest of all social differentiators, quite often determines which variety of language a speaker would use. So in a city, let's say like Baghdad, the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim inhabitants speak different varieties of Arabic language. So in this case, the first two groups use their variety solely within the group, but the Muslim variety serves as a lingua franca, so or common language. So among the groups. So consequently, Christians and the Jews who deal with Muslims must use two varieties, their own at home and the Muslim variety for trade in all intergroup relationships. So ethnic variation can be seen in the United States, and where one variety of English has become so identified with an ethnic group that it is often referred to as an African American vernacular English. So Lubov's work in New York City shows that there are other ethnic differences too. Speakers of Jewish and Italian authenticity differentiate themselves from speakers of either the standard variety of Ave, or on occasion that they actually show hypercorrective tendencies, in that they tend to overdo certain imitative behaviors. Italians are inclined to be in the vanguard of pronouncing words like bat and bag with a vowel resembling that the beard, and Jews in the vanguard of pronouncing words like dog with a vowel, sometimes like that of a book. So a possible motivation for such behavior is a desire to move away from the Italian and Yiddish vowels that speakers could so easily use in these words, but which could be clear ethnic markers. So however, the movement prompted by such avoidance behavior goes beyond the prevailing local norms and becomes an ethnic characteristic that serves as an indicator of identity and solidarity. Now, studies in social dialectology, the terms used to refer to this branch of linguistic study, confront many issues, difficult issues, particularly when investigators venture into the city. So cities are much more difficult to characterize linguistically than are rural hamlets. So variation in language and patterns of change are more obvious in cities. For example, in family structures, employment and opportunities for social advancement or decline. Then migration both in and out of cities is also usually a potent linguistic factor. So cities also spread their influence far beyond their limits, and their importance should never be underestimated in considering such matters as the standardization and diffusion of language. So in later chapters, we will look closely at the importance of language variations in cities and see how important such variation is in trying to understand how and why change occurs in language. So in this way, we may also come to appreciate why some sociolinguists regard such variations as being at the heart of the work in social linguistics. So we might appreciate why some of them would say that. So Gumpers in 1968 maintains that separate languages maintain themselves most readily in closed tribal systems in which kinship dominates all activities. So on the other hand, distinctive varieties arise in highly stratified societies. So he points out that when social change causes the breakdown of traditional social structures and the formation of new ties, linguistic barriers between varieties also break down. So can you think of any examples which either conform or disconform this claim? So if some social dialects may properly be labeled non-standard, Labov raises a very important issue in connection with finding speakers who can supply reliable data concerning such varieties. So he would say that we have not encountered any non-standard speakers who gained good control of a standard language and still retained control of the non-standard vernacular. So dialect differences depend upon how lower level rules which appear as minor adjustments and extensions of contextual conditions. So it appears that such conditions inevitably interact, and although the speaker may indeed appear to be speaking the vernacular, those close examination of his speech shows that his grammar has been heavily influenced by the standard. So he may succeed in convincing his listeners that he is speaking the vernacular, but this impression seems to depend upon a number of unsystematic and heavily marked signals. So if Labov's observation is correct, what must we do to gain access to any information that we seek about the non-standard vernacular, and what difficulties that do you foresee? So when we say that yes, how are language norms established and perpetuated in rather isolated rural communities, for example a small village in the west of England or in the northern Vermont or in the interior of British Columbia, we would say that how different do you think the situation is in London and in New York or Vancouver? Now, they would be very similar also. Let's say, how different do you think the situation would be there? So when we say that, yes, a small village in west of England or northern Vermont or the interior of British Columbia, and how the situations are in London, New York, or Vancouver. So are there any similarities at all? How are language norms established overall in England and the United States and Canada? So the study of dialects is further styles, registers, and beliefs. So the study of dialects is further complicated by the fact that speakers can adopt different styles of speaking. You can speak very formally or very informally, your choice being governed by the circumstances. Ceremonial occasions almost invariably require very formal speech, public lectures, somewhat less formal, casual conversation, quite informal, and conversations between intimates on matters of little importance may be extremely informal and casual. So we may try to relate the level of formality chosen to a variety of factors. So the kind of occasion, the various social, age, and other differences that exist between the participants, the particular task that is involved, for example, writing and speaking. So the emotional involvement of one or more of the participants and so on. So we appreciate that such distinctions exist when we recognize the stylistic appropriateness of what do you intend to do, and your majesty, and the inappropriateness of what you intend doing, Rex. So while it may be difficult to characterize discrete levels of formality, it is nevertheless possible to show that native speakers of all languages control a range of stylistic varieties. So it is also quite possible to predict with considerable confidence the stylistic features that a native speaker will tend to employ on certain occasions. So register is another complicating factor in any study of language of varieties. So registers are a set of language items associated with discrete occupational or social groups. So surgeons, airlines, pilots, bank managers, sales clerks, jazz fans, and pimps would employ different registers. As Ferguson says, the people participating in recurrent communication situations tend to develop similar vocabularies, similar features of intonation, and characteristic bits of syntax and phonology that they use in these situations. So this kind of variety is a register. Ferguson adds that its special terms of recurrent objects and events and formulaic consequences or routines seem to facilitate speedy communication. So other features apparently serve to mark the register, establish feelings of rapport, and serve other purposes similar to the accommodation that influences dialect information or formation. So there is no mistaking the strong tendency for individuals and co-communicators to develop registered variations along many dimensions. So of course one person may control a variety of registers. You can be a stockbroker and an archaeologist, or a mountain climber and an economist. So each register helps you to express your identity at a specific time or place. That is how you seek or to present yourself for others. So dialect, style, and register differences are largely independent. You can talk casually about mountain climbing in a local variety of a language, and you can write a formal technical study of winemaking. So you may also be judged to speak better or worse than other speakers who have much of the same background. So it is quite usual to find some people who are acknowledged to speak a language, and one of its varieties better or worse than the others. So today, dear students, that would be the end of the lecture. We will continue in the next lecture. Thank you so much, and have a good day.